Hi, guys. Good morning. I am joined today by the 12th Secretary of Education, Dr. Cardona. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Call me Miguel, please.
Miguel.
Yeah.
I have my audience is like kind of anywhere from older millennial to like older Zoomer.
Yep.
So education is a very hot topic among my audience. They're in that age of, some people are getting into their career a bit. They still have student loans. Some people are looking at school. They feel like it's unaffordable. Young people on the internet are very loud. They all have lots of opinions about education and stuff related to funding.
Some of them are having kids.
So the millennial people now. Yeah,
thinking
definitely.
schools,
Yeah, true. Almost, yeah. I have a 14-year-old son, so we're almost getting there. Yeah. I guess my first question is, this is kind of like the broad thing that everybody talks about for education. I remember a quote a long time ago I heard. I don't know who said it, but it was like, if you were to take somebody from the 16th century and bring them into modern America or the modern world, the only thing they would recognize are the schools. What if there was like one top-down thing, I guess, that you could change about education in America? If you could snap your fingers and do it, what do you think would be like the best change we could make?
You know, you're right. Desks facing forward, where the person in the front of the classroom is spitting out information, the pupils are regurgitating it. That hasn't changed much in many parts of our country. I think if there's one thing I could change top down, is just make sure that there's a system for evolution of education. And I do think we have it. I don't think we utilize it much. I think it's really just engaging our students, the consumers of it, right? They know better where we're going. I think AI is a perfect example where we have people that don't understand it trying to put like walls around it or implement it with their limited understanding of it, while the generation that's using it is far beyond the way the system is thinking about it. So that could be AI today. That could be, you name the topic over the years. I think it's too archaic in its design. Evolving it is what I would change, not a certain thing, because the thing will change.
Yeah.
The way it's designed, I think, is what needs work.
So before we get into, I guess, like potential changes, can you kind of speak to the role that the federal government plays in education? Because there's a lot of different thoughts about what the federal government actually does. Let's back up and pretend the Department of Education still exists as it did when you were the secretary. Yeah.
Well, let me go back, right?
Sure.
So I want to share with you and the audience, like, I was a fourth grade teacher, right? So I did that. I was a school principal. I did that for 10 years. So I was able to see the role of education from different levels. I was a district leader for a little while. I was a commissioner of education in Connecticut for a little while. Then I went to, so my responses are based not only on my role as a secretary of education for President Biden for 4 years, but also my whole 27 years of being an educator. The federal role is really small. It's really small, and it's designed that way. And I want it to be that way, because when I was a teacher, I didn't care what Washington, D.C. was telling me to do. I cared what my local board was telling me, what the students needed. So it's a very small role. Federal government provides 9% of funding only. Not a lot, but important funding.
Just to clarify also, that used to be true. Do you know if that's still true post, I guess, abolishing of the Department of Education? Or
there's limits in funding that were moved in the last year. So,
gotcha.
But overall, it's a very small pocket of funding, right? It's mostly a civil rights agency, right? So to protect the rights of students so that they can have access to public education across. It's an agency whose job is to administer the funding that Congress approves, right? So I'm showing that it's not this big thing that the federal government right now is saying it was. Oh, we got to give it back to the states. It was always the state's responsibility. I was a commissioner of education, and I could tell you that when I was commissioner, the federal government didn't tell me what to do, how to do things. That was never the case. And when I was secretary, despite having experience in different pockets of education, I knew it wasn't my job to tell them how to run, curriculum in classrooms in Florida, whatever. So I think that was just part of the whole shtick, to try to make it seem like it's this behemoth. It's one of the smallest agencies at the federal level. So
just to hammer this point home, because I remember it was probably 10 years ago, there was the Common Core scare.
Right.
my understanding, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is my understanding is the federal government has basically zero input when it comes to curriculum for the states.
Right.
That it's not, it doesn't dictate like this is how you teach. Here's your curriculum for the day. There's a lot of people, and by that I mean like half the country seem to believe that the federal government was telling states exact. And I'm saying this because one of the things that was so often repeated a few months ago was we're giving education back to the states. We're giving education back to the states to run it. But it was always that way, is my understanding.
It was, and I'll get to the Common Core. But the funny thing is, I don't think it's funny, but
So many things that
there is more federal requirements now. There's more policing of what you're doing, or you're going to pull your money back. Not only in K-12, but higher ed, right? So, if anything, while we're saying we're giving it back to the states, we're mandating what you can and cannot do in the classrooms, or else we're going to pull your money. But going back to the Common Core, there was an effort there to standardize what kids knew across the country, so that when we're comparing Alabama to Kentucky to Nebraska to Connecticut, we have a similar standard of what success looks like. And you saw the backlash there, right? And the intent there was to say, you know, if we say a B in Arkansas is similar to a B in Oregon, you know, there's some relative comparison. You could say, well, what's working, what's not working, right? Because as a former district leader and commissioner of education, I knew that a passing score in Connecticut might be something totally different in another state. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That was the intent, in my opinion, there.
Are there any standard requirements right now for tests like federally that students should be able to pass, or is all of that still left, like given the testing requirements for the states?
You know, it has gotten to the point where you can make some comparisons. It's still not a perfect system. I think, you know, that's where like the SATs or, you know, the other tests like that come into play, because if you know, a score in an SAT doesn't matter what state you're in, right? So I think that's kind of what does that, and that's why I think there's a heavy reliance on those type of things when it comes to admission, because we don't have you know, a score on a state test in one state means nothing in another.
Yeah. When you talk about scoring things and you talk about grades, I hear from every level, from teachers to parents to students, you know, there's like this binary of teaching the subject versus teaching to the test.
Right.
Do you have an opinion on?
I have an opinion on everything in education,
Okay,
so you know, it's a loaded question. And again, most of my opinion comes from my experience in the classroom, being a school principal. I'm a big believer that we must assess where students are, or else we're playing games. Because I've seen cases where students have gotten A's on their report card and they're thrilled, and then when it comes to an assessment that measures their ability to understand state standards, they're below basic. I've seen that, and unfortunately, it happens disproportionately to students in underperforming communities, right? So I'm a big believer in high standards and making sure that our assessments are aligned with standards. But I've also seen the opposite, where we've become overly enamored with standardized tests to the point where we remove topics that are not going to be covered, or we reduce pedagogy and teaching to the way the students are going to see it on the test, which in my opinion disengages students. And then we wonder why kids don't want to go to school, or they're not doing well. Yeah.
What do you think when it comes to like one of the big issues we have today is it seems like the scoring for American students for basic things.
Yeah.
I feel like I read an article a couple weeks ago related to like even being able to read at a competent level, like a high school level, that more and more of the population is sliding into not being able to do this.
Yeah.
What do you think, where are the big failures today coming in from for education?
Well, you know, it's multifaceted, right? But I do feel that we are not where we should be internationally on the international tests. I think, you know, a close look at our assessment data over the years, for decades, it's not something that we, you know, there should be a sense of urgency around addressing it. And then you add the pandemic that really disproportionately affected students who didn't have access, and it made gaps worse. You know, we really need to have a sense of urgency around it. I think a lot of it has to do with, number one, and you know, you're going to hear a common theme in this conversation. We pay teachers 24% less than people with similar degrees in other professions. You know, when I walked in as secretary, there was shortages of educators across the country. People were just not interested in the profession, not to mention that they're being blamed. So I've had conversations with the Minister of Education of Finland. I've had conversations with the Minister of Education in Singapore, right? So these are the countries that we're aspiring to. There's no magic. They treat the profession like a profession. They're selective with who's in front of the classroom. They're compensated to the point where they don't have to bartend or drive Uber on the weekends. They're given professional learning opportunities, and schools are treated as the foundation for their country's growth. So to me, it's really investing in making sure that we're respecting the profession, that our schools have the tools that they need. And we've seen examples of that. New York Times reported while I was secretary that the gap between black students and non-black students in fourth grade closed more in 1 year. I think it was 22 to 23 than at any other point before 2009. There was an investment in addressing the disparities. So I do worry that we're just taking an approach like we want Finland results, but we don't put in Finland investments. I do think that's a bigger argument. So schools are the byproduct of us not valuing education in this country the way we should. And I think we're seeing that now with the dismantling of it, with the attacks on higher education, with vouchers where some students have access to education, other students are left with whatever's left over in the public schools. So I think we're going in the wrong direction in terms of that. But until we as a country can really recognize that if we don't have a strong foundation, you're not going to build skyscrapers. And what does that look like? I do think accountability is a part of it too. I'm not trying to say that funding is the only thing. We need to make sure that we're holding folks accountable for results. And I do think accountability is a big part of it, but I also think support has to be a part of it. And we like the accountability part, but in many places, there's not enough support for our students.
When you bring up the accountability part, are you pretty familiar with I'm sure you are, the No Child Left Behind and kind of the fallout from that?
Yeah.
My understanding is some of the critiques on that were initially people were saying, the high accountability of No Child Left Behind and funding schools or allocating money to places that produce better results was going to be more positive, but then other people were saying there was the lack of support there and it just had some communities fall further behind.
Yeah.
What do you have? I guess what in an ideal world, let me back up a bit, I guess. Education is very frustrating to me because I feel like sometimes when I look at education, it feels like like police or criminal justice, right? Like if you ask a cop, how do you get people to do less crime? Well, by the time the cop is seeing them, it's almost already over. I was incredibly lucky growing up in that I got to go to a private school, and you can look at the differences between private school education and public school education. But as somebody that's been through private school, the teachers are more motivated and all of that for sure. But man, if your parents are paying a little money to send you to a school, every student there is there to learn, and the parents are invested in their education, and the students are invested in their education. They have to be. And sometimes it feels bad because when I look at the education system, if you get, I don't know if you've ever seen The Wire. One of those guys that watched The Wire, and it's my favorite show. Yeah, but by the time the student gets to class, it's like 80% of the battle can already be won or lost. So going back to the No Child Left Behind, what do you think are good types of accountability that can exist for schools that can push teachers and educators forward and ones that don't just hamper their ability to deal with problem students? Yeah.
When that came through, I was starting as a school principal in 2003, and I'll give you a quick story. I was a school principal at a school that high performing school for the district. Right. We had a program for students who are learning English, a bilingual program in that school. And the way NCLB was written up, if you have more than 20 students, I think it was 20 or 40 students of a subgroup that doesn't make mastery, that whole school is in need of improvement. And then, the headlines would be failing school. Right. And I had students who were learning English who were being assessed in a language that they didn't even understand yet. So those students didn't hit mastery. And I remember a parent coming up to me saying, is our school a failing school because of those kids? and that stuck with me, man, because I was one of those kids when I was in elementary school. And that just is an example of what was inherently wrong with a system that's a one-size-fits-all. I'm a big believer in accountability as well. I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to stuff like that. Richard Elmore's work, the principle of reciprocity. For every ounce of support, I have to give you an ounce of accountability. Or Michael Fullan's work that says, support and accountability are important, but you don't lead with accountability. The wrong drivers. So for me, it's like, hold me accountable if there's support there to get me to where I need to go. And I think with NCLB, it led with accountability. It led with labeling. So it disincentivized working in urban schools where the students were struggling. Now, don't get me wrong, as a Latino, I loved some parts of it. I loved the fact that we're now disaggregating data based on race, economically disadvantaged students with disabilities. That to me was really important, because what that did was say, look, we have a gap, an opportunity gap that we have to address. And while the school that I was working in, an amazing school, we had to be honest about saying there are some students that, given the same experience, are still underperforming. We have to address that. So race and place should never be determinants of success. I think the one-size-fits-all thing, I think the negative attention that it put, or the labeling that it put on schools that were doing twice the work. You mentioned you went to a private school. You probably didn't have the level of poverty that many of our public schools face. Mm-hmm. You probably didn't have students that were experiencing some of the similar trauma that many of our schools and kids in our public schools face. And a public school teacher has to work twice as hard. And I would argue they're twice as motivated. It's easier to go to an independent school and work, getting paid, and not deal with some of those issues. I got teachers that were feeding kids before it was a national program to feed kids. I got teachers that were serving as social workers, that were doing what they needed to do to make sure that these kids were able to, you know what I mean? And that's why I'll always fight for public education to be the great equalizer, right? So NCLB, what it did was, unfortunately, it put a spotlight on, one size doesn't fit all. And the backlash to it, I think, took away some of the things that I wish could have stayed, with higher standards, higher accountability. And then I would argue with accountability, it's good to have. We need to have it. But it needs to evolve too. We can't just base everything on one test. And what ended up happening through NCLB, in my opinion, is we reduced what we taught to what was going to be tested. And then there was a phenomenon that I'm going to introduce you to today. It's called bubble kids. Bubble kids. You ever hear of that?
No, but I did the ITBS, and I know the I'm guessing
the Scantron stuff, right?
Filling out the
well, bubble kids actually there was a phenomenon where when you're measuring students and labeling a school and determining funding and determining which principals get hired and fired, you're basing it on a mastery, the number of students that hit mastery, right? So there were students that were way over the mastery level. They're fine. And then there were students that were way, way below the mastery level. And then there were students that were on the bubble, the kids that were close to mastery. A lot of our schools just focused on the kids that were at the bubble.
Oh, okay.
So all the support and attention went to these kids here. The kids that were high performing got ignored. The kids that were well below the mastery level weren't given the attention that they needed. They focus on the bubble kids. And when you have a system that does that, you're missing an opportunity to make sure every kid grows and every kid reaches their potential. So I saw that from the field. I saw that as a practitioner. And I felt like, when we over-rely on one accountability measure, we're hurting the system in a way that hurts more kids at the top and kids that are really, really struggling.
Do you think it's possible to push education in my mind, I usually break out like K through 12. I think there's a lot of different higher education.
Yeah, it is.
Is it possible to push K through 12 like substantially forward in a positive direction without all of us kind of coming together and recognizing maybe the need for like a little bit more federal oversight? I know it's a scary phrase.
Yeah, I know. Well, my thing was when I was secretary, I'm like, look, don't think I don't have opinions as a fourth grade teacher now, walking into the Oval Office, giving the president advice on education, as a school principal, right? As a first gen college student myself, I had a lot of opinions on what we could do federally, but I also knew, would I want Betsy DeVos doing something like that? Would I want the person following me that maybe had that's not good for the field to have a yo-yo effect, right? We're seeing it now. So for me, it was about strengthening states and giving school districts the opportunity to leverage what works best, right? So we need to know what's working in Florida. We need to know what's working in Tennessee to lift that up and say, hey, this is working. Michigan, what they're doing for college and career pathways should be something that every state should know about, right? So I think what the federal role should be is to highlight what's working in different parts of the country, invest in those promising practices across the country, but not necessarily hold a stick and say, if you don't do it the way I say you do it, we're gonna take your money away. The students lose in that scenario.
A quick, I guess, political pit stop. Something that I didn't really consider before. I had a friend that worked at the Kennedy Space Center down in Houston, and I never considered the significance until talking to him about how weird it is sometimes that you have these cabinet level secretaries that are in and out every 4 years.
Yeah.
And he was complaining that sometimes it's hard to get long-term investment or planning in a particular direction because you don't know if the next, cabinet leader is going to take you in a whole different direction. And sometimes it makes even private companies a little bit reluctant to invest because they're not sure where things are going.
That's real. That's real. And I recognize that even while I was in the chair, right? That what I call the yo-yo effect.
Yeah.
Right? Look at higher ed right now. Like everything that they did to try to bring, make sure that their student body looks as beautifully diverse as our country is now being used to pull money away from them. Right? So I could see where there's a hesitation to jump on to things that the federal government is doing because it's not going to last long, which is why I think it's really important that we moving forward, we look at things that we can find some common ground on certain things in education. I've always felt education shouldn't be politicized for that reason. I know it sounds hokey, but it really, we should rise above that. And they're all of our kids, right? I'm not Secretary of Education just for the Democrat kids, right? If anything, I think the harm that's happening now is hurting red communities more.
Sure.
So
I was going to ask you on that. Do you have the feeling, especially, we get older, I'm 37 now, and I've been saying probably for the last 20 years, statements like this is the most important presidential election ever and things have never been this bad. And, people always say this. And now being a little bit older, I try to look back and I was like, okay, well, what, there are some things where I recognize I'm saying this as an aging person, right? Like the 6-7 thing seems really dumb to me. And I'm thinking like, this is like the kids are just dumber than they've ever been. But then I think, well, when I was a kid, there were a million things that I thought were hilarious that my parents thought were stupid or didn't understand. So I'm trying to like keep track of things. When I look at education, things like I think even when I was a kid, things like vouchers and things like homeschooling were pretty politicized. But man, COVID really drove a wedge into everything. Do you feel like it's more, like everything feels like it's a political battleground these days? And when it's a political battleground, that there's no room, you can't even begin to talk about fixing anything because it feels like you don't even have people agreeing on what is real or what isn't real or what people are talking about. Yeah,
I'm an educator, not a politician. That's how I think, and what I've seen is the politics creep in so much. And I argued, I was campaigning last year, and I said, every year there's a new boogeyman. In 2020, when I got in, right? 2021, it was the masks. 2022, it was CRT. 2023, it was transphobia. 2024, it was, banning books. So there was a new boogeyman every year, and I would put money on it. This is part of the strategy to make people afraid of public education so the private voucher sounds better. Let's commercialize K-12 like we did higher ed. There's a profit to be made. So I think it's inherently built into the bigger picture to create disruption so that the alternative sounds better than public education. I really do believe that's part of the strategy. It has people talking about transgender in bathrooms, which is not an issue. When I visited 50 states in 4 years, we needed to get kids to read. We had mental health crisis in our country. 1 in 3 high school girls considered suicide after the pandemic. That's the issues that people are talking about. That's not a red or blue issue, right? So we push for mental health supports. We push. So yet they politicize the things that create division. And I think that's by design. And sadly, what we end up doing is spending our bandwidth on responding versus talking about, no, we have a youth mental health crisis. No, we have students that are not reading. We have students that are not learning AI at the pace that they should because in China, they're learning it much quicker. We have students that are going through what you said, 15th century style education, while we have careers that are going unfilled because our schools haven't evolved yet. You follow me? So I do think that's by design. I think that's part of the plan to really destabilize support for public education by making educators or making our schools look like they're doing bad things to our kids, and we got to protect our kids. We're spending more time talking about that than how many kids die in our schools, or
One of my big complaints about really politics in general is that we're sometimes you get these issues that pop up that I would say are dumb issues. And even if you win the debate on the issue, I don't think people realize you've already lost. That if there's kind of like an old, for like internet forums or Reddit or social media, there's this old adage sometimes of there are certain people you don't engage with.
Yeah.
You might see a post that says, today, my sports team, did really well. And you want to go in and you want to post about how good their quarterback is. And there's a guy in there that just posted about how I think that the defensive coordinator is actually racist. He's a horrible, terrible human being. And you're like, oh, okay, well, you might write a big post and you might be right. And you've got, well, actually, this is not true and blah, blah, blah. And you might even feel good after responding. But what you don't consider is that you came in there to post something positive. You got sidetracked by this guy who's just being an asshole. And then you've spent all this energy and time responding to him. And the positivity you wanted to contribute is not even there. And that kind of feels like a microcosm sometimes of our entire
You just
world.
summarized 4 years as Secretary of Education.
Yeah.
Do I go forward and say, it's the great equalizer. This is what we're going to do. We're going to focus on this. We're going to, rural America, 9 million students need attention, man. They're being ignored. Or do I respond to the CRT, the things that are being thrown up? And I think that's a reality. My comms team would tell you in DC, Miguel, don't even respond to that. Don't waste your bandwidth on that. Yeah. Really, Miguel, don't respond to that. If you get this question, pivot to that, because you got to talk about the proactive stuff you're doing, but that's not sexy. What's sexy is the division or the story of what happened in one community. And I think in a lot of ways, it's just really smart marketing to create distractions. And I mean, I don't have to get into the distractions that are being created on a national level today to distract from some of the things that people are really dealing with the economy, with, there's more division. And so distractions is a strategy. And I think in education over the last 4 years, I told you, the boogeyman of the year, CRT, that's not happening in our classrooms. The homophobia that was made to feel so bad, and it's not that we shouldn't have those conversations, but it shouldn't take up 90% of how we're using our time. As Secretary of Education, I had to focus on the things that were important to 50 million students across our country.
One of the things that's very difficult to communicate to people when it comes to like scientific research or political discussions in general is this concept of like effect size or magnitude,
right.
Where, somebody might want to spend 95% of the time talking about, God, like I roll my eyes when I see, the president signing these executive orders and there's like 50 schoolgirls around him and he's like, I'm saving their education. I was like, oh my God, like give me a break. But then, people will look at that and it's like, oh, so you don't think it's worth talking about? And it's like, I mean, like maybe for a microsecond or whatever. But like, I know that if this particular thing was an issue, I'm trying not to get ultra political, but like if all this trans stuff in the bathroom was a huge issue, I know it would be a huge issue because every single time a bad event happens, you guys would be screaming about it from the rooftops and you're not. And the fact that there's I think there was one case in, I think it was Virginia, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I was just at the state doing an event. But it was like one thing that happened and nobody, it was like a student who identified as something else and some incident came up. But other than that, it's like, this is not, I don't know how we're spending 90% of the time talking about a thing when our reading scores are so low, when we're having so much trouble coordinating between states, like what education should look like. We're having conversations about what higher education should be, but we're barely talking about that. And instead we're talking about who the last swimmer was and what place they got. And it's like, Jesus.
And it's really important. And that's a good point, because I think that's what we click on. It was a lot of clickbait. And when I was doing media in DC, I was very careful. Like, I'd get on these big networks and I knew I had 90 seconds. And they're going to want to get to that clickbait, right? And I'm thinking to myself, how do I pivot to say, no, we're increasing access and affordability to college so more kids could have access. And I'm trying, how do I squeeze that in? It was more about how do I pivot and get to what I want to say. Ask me whatever you want to ask me, but I'm going to get to the things that matter to 50 million students to make sure kids are having access to mental health supports, that they're eating in school. We had a lot of kids hungry in school. That they have access to higher education, that Pell dollars are increasing so that they could go to college and reach their dream, right? So, but that's not, you're not going to get me on one of those major networks for me to talk about how the Pell Grant went up $900 for every American that qualifies for it, because that closed gaps in access to higher education. That's never going to get a call. Yeah. Now, the incident in Virginia might get me, 90 seconds on a network. So how do I pivot that? It was like I was dancing. Yeah.
my brain has broken a lot over the past couple of years, but I think one of the worst
Bringing
things
up a lot of bad.
yeah, well, now because you bring up the because there are some things, especially now as a parent, where it's like,
Yep.
how are you at some board and you're arguing against school lunches? Like that's like a demonic position. Not to we're free to have our opinions on things, but I remember watching. Do you know who Piers Morgan is? Are you familiar? I think it was him and a few other people on a panel, and they were talking about the ingeniousness of like RFK's plan to make school lunches more healthy or something.
Love it.
And they were talking about how, can you imagine how crazy it would be for Democrats to fight against something that would be so obviously good? And I'm just remembering all the pushback Michelle Obama got from all of these Republicans. You're not going to tell our kids what to eat if they want to eat pizza every day. And I was like, I'm glad you guys are on board with it finally, but like, Jesus.
Or they forget to mention that, one of the first things that they did was cut the funding to give meals to schools, to kids, that cut the programs, right? That left kids hungry, or summer programming that didn't get their funding for dollars. So it's really, it's not the substance, it's the comms. There's a comms approach to this. To get people only have attention span for 10, 15 seconds. They're going to listen to the top lines. What's in the devil's in the details, right? But that's never really parsed out. But I hear you. Yeah, that's just kind of what it's like. And I'm going to be honest with you. I talk to people, colleagues from the Hill, Congress people from the Hill, off camera. I had these crazy 4 or 5 hour hearings where I was getting badgered. You've seen them. And
I saw the intro, the one representative of the Republican Foxx, I think. Yeah.
So let me tell you, and Virginia Foxx, Congresswoman Foxx. So you know what? Quick story about her. I've never said this anywhere else.
Yeah.
So we met maybe a little bit before that, right? Mm-hmm. And it's really theater.
Oh no! It's the same. It really is.
It's theater.
Yeah.
We met before that. She was a former college president. She came from a poor community. We had more in common, than people would imagine. And I remember sitting in her office and we're chatting. She goes, I think you're going to be just fine. She made me a cup of coffee. We're having coffee in her office. And she's like, if it was just, it's too bad you're with Biden. It's too bad you have those people around you, because I think you would be a good one. And then she commences to try to tear me apart in front of the cameras. And then, we've had conversations after that stuff. And she goes, I would never have support from my party if I ever agreed with you on anything. Mm-hmm. College and career pathways is a purple issue. We need kids to have access to these high-skill, high-paying careers. We were working really hard in the Biden administration to open that up. And I'm still focusing on that. Post-secretary, one of my big focuses is making sure kids, I was a tech school graduate. So I know the value of, learning skills to go on to get career or college, right? So she agreed with that. But she would never co-sign something with me, because how dare I work with the Biden administration? That's crazy.
Yeah.
We're hurting kids. And I think that's happening rampant. And I'm sure it goes both ways, but I can tell you, I did this on purpose, and maybe it was a little cynical of me.
Sure.
I hand wrote letters to her saying, hey, we agree on this. Could we work together on it? And the closest we came was when I think her husband someone tried to scam her husband on student loan debt stuff, or payment or something like that. He got a scam email, and she said, we got to go after those scammers. I'm like, you're right. Let's work together on it. And we were close, but her staff didn't let her co-sign something with me. But that's the toxicity that exists right now in people that are responsible for making decisions for our students. So, anyway, those hearings were crazy. But
yeah, real quick, I'm kind of curious, because I have a few friends that have been grilled in closed door and open door hearings. I've heard it both ways. I've heard some say that they hate closed door hearings, because what happens is whatever you say closed door, that transcript or whatever, deposition, whatever, that might never be public, and that some of the people, I won't say names like Jim Jordan, but like some of these people might take quotes selectively from these, and then publicly you don't have the full context of anything. So like, I hate closed door hearings. Yeah. And then if other people say, well, for an open door hearing, I'm being farmed for TikTok. You're here to ask me the craziest question ever. You're looking for a yes or no. You're going to reclaim your time. I'm reclaiming my time. I'm reclaiming my time. I need you to answer this. You hate students. I'm reclaiming my time.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So you're saying you would let your daughter go into the locker room with... Yeah. It was all... and shout out to my team. Team 46, man. They were amazing. And my team would make sure that, Miguel, don't fall in the traps. Don't fall. So we had a system.
It's hard. Those conversations are really hard.
You want the
to do
inside
live.
baseball? You want the inside?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
so
sure, yeah.
I had 5-hour hearings, and I had maybe 45, 50 people that were going to come grill me. And I would have a coding system, 1, 2, and 3. 1, friendly fire. It's not going to be, not friendly fire, friendly, 2, it could go either way. 3, just be ready. You're going to have 5 minutes of hell. So when I got to those 3s, those people that were going to come after me, and I knew what their topics were, I knew what was important to them, and I knew that they were Twitter farming, right? So watch what I say, make sure that my statement doesn't end, don't pause after something that they could take and clip. But I would, and then I would get, I'm like, oh, damn, they got me. They, I said this, but they didn't catch the second part of the sentence. That's what it was. So I would spend months preparing for these hearings where they were just trying to get a clip.
Yeah.
And, that's sad when, the Secretary of Education or any other department, that's what your preparation is for somebody who's Twitter farming and not trying to work collaboratively on an issue. But that it is what it is. Now, do you spend time going back and saying, no, this is what I said? Or do you take your bandwidth away from the issues that you really need to focus on, or just responding to that? And that's kind of where we are, man.
One of the funniest this one actually saddest things is that for like my life has been doing content creation. I've been like a YouTuber streamer for, 16, 17 years now. And as the political situation has changed in the United States, I got into, I was a professional gamer, and then I got into kind of like politics more around 2016, as so much of the world did. But I've noticed as I'm analyzing politics, I just try to think of more and more things as like a YouTuber, because it really is like influencer politics. And it's so funny because I look at these hearings or whatever, and they're so similar to a lot of the political debates I do. And you mentioned like the whole like getting cut and clipped and everything. And one of my fans had the suggestion once of like, when you do debates, you should go in, like with a giant clock, like on your chest, so that if anybody ever cuts something, you can see the time like skip around or whatever. And it's
no, look, I think you're saying something to me that what it triggers in my mind is, what if we flip the script instead of having our content be the way the system has it and trying to reach, the younger generation, why don't we flip it and create content in the way that the younger generation consumes it? We have to look at things from the perspective of the consumer, and we're not doing that well.
Yeah.
I think part of the issue, the reason why we lost the election is not because the majority of people don't agree with what we're trying to do, but just we didn't reach the consumers in a way that they're used to being reached. I think we did that wrong, and I think we need to learn from that. So I commend you. I commend folks like you. I have a 21-year-old at home and a 19-year-old at home. And I try to look at the world from their lens. And I remember, especially during the election cycle, how ineffective I felt we were, because the 19-year-old and 21-year-old at home were not hearing the messages that I was saying.
Well, I talk about this a lot. I think one of the big brutal things that the left kind of messed up on over the past couple of decades was this. One was the assumption that we won the culture and it's done, so we don't even have to justify our positions. And the second was, well, right-wing points are just easier to sell than left-wing points, because the right wing is simpler and the left wing is more complicated. And, there are these people that, and I've gone through so many changes of mind where these people are all idiots, to where, these people are pretty sophisticated, they just get the wrong information, to these people or whatever. And, and I really look at them and I'm like, these people are pretty smart. When a guy comes up and they're like, I don't trust the mRNA vaccines because I prefer things like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine because of the partners. Like, well, he's not an idiot. He's not stupid. Now, I think he's got a lot of incorrect information, but the capacity for remembering stuff is there. Like, they know it. And the right has spent, my mom is Cuban. I grew up very conservative. Okay, I was a rider that we cried when Elian Gonzalez. Yeah, we cried when Elian Gonzalez. My mom. I read. I think you learned in kindergarten, first grade Spanish. My mom came over. She learned in school, awesome. And so we grew up crying when Elian Gonzalez went back, and Hayden Clinton and everything else. And to just to see how people on the right have spent so long like honing the entertainment apparatus. Growing up and listening to people like Rush Limbaugh and Michael Savage and Glenn Beck, and these guys were funny, they were entertaining, they bullied callers, and then the stereotype for the left was the NPR voice, right? The boring, factual, whatever stuff. And it's funny because our most successful media figure and he didn't really want that mantle, and we never recognized it. But it was really Jon Stewart for millennials, for like left-leaning political education. It shouldn't have been, but it was. And yeah, I think finally it's taken a while, but I think I look at people like Gavin Newsom. I look at people like, you talk about the pivot to the important topics. He's further left than me, but Mamdani is so good at that in speaking. And I think the left is finally starting to get there. But yeah, that messaging is so important. And then one more thing, because you mentioned like the clipping and everything else. There was a world where I'm sympathetic to people politicking. So somebody's on their side, they've got to bully you. You're on your side, you got to fight with them. And behind closed doors, you're more friendly than it seems. And that was, I could accept that world when there was a point to it, but it seems like now there's this like simulacrum of showmanship to where the clips are done and that's it. It's just to make the attention on the clip, and that's it. There is no real policy goal anymore. No. There is no aim. It's like, yeah, going through the government with a sledgehammer, destroying as much as you can.
It's performative. It's performative. It really is. And I remember having dinner with Senator Burr at the time in North Carolina. He was like a ranking member of the Education Committee in the Senate. And this was early on, and we were talking about the important things that we agreed on. And I don't agree with a lot of his policies, right? But what he said was, look, there's extremes on both sides. How could we move the needle for education on the things that we know we could do? Like, college career pathways, mental health, or making sure students had access, right, to higher ed. Now, how to get there, we would disagree, but let's focus on those things. Let's not let it be a circus. He's no longer there. Even that side realized, if you're not going to be part of this performative circus, you're not going to have a place. And you mentioned before a couple folks who are in politics, whether it's Mamdani or Governor Newsom, they're just talking in the language of the consumer. And we've lost sight of that. And I think part of it is we became too righteous, and we're fighting each other and not realizing we're getting swarmed, right? And I think what we have to do is really just kind of realize where we are, and we're missing an opportunity with our young generation. We're missing an opportunity with Latinos to talk about the values, right? And we saw that in the results. We got to wake up, or we're going to see more of this. And we got to be on offense, not defense. And in terms of education, one of the things I'm really trying to focus on now is, where is our common ground? What do we think? I say it's not a red or blue issue, it's a green issue, right? Economic mobility for our kids matters, man. We want our kids to be able to get out of high school and have options. I'm from Connecticut, and we have a submarine base over there. And, whether it's left or right in D.C., it doesn't matter. Defense contracts, we want our students to have those jobs. And we want them to be making the dollars, but our schools, are they aligned to give our students preparation for that? And what are we doing to make sure that our kids have access to that our higher education institutions are working with our industry partners to give students those opportunities to make higher education relevant and make it worthwhile. Make sure that the return on investment is there because the careers are there. And I think we have work to do there. That's not a blue or red issue. I say it's a green issue because it's economic stability not only for the students, but for the state. Which state doesn't want, microchip manufacturers knocking on their door saying, can I set up shop here? Because your school systems are feeding the employees that I need. That's the work that I'm trying to focus on. I was trying to do it in D.C. with limited success because I think red or blue, we can't work with Biden in the state because, then Trump's going to get mad at us. But right now, I think there's an appetite for this across the country. And I think, quite frankly, if you get a lot of Republican leaders in a closed door without a camera on, they're going to say, I'm just tired of this nonsense. I want to make sure that we can do what's right for our kids, regardless of where it comes from.
So again, from streamer world, one of the most frustrating things that I would deal with is, so your biggest fear, this might actually map onto maybe your life. Have you ever had the moment where you wake up and you've got like 30 text messages or emails and they're like, are you okay or whatever?
Yeah.
Oh God.
What happened?
Oh no. What just got published? What just went live? And it was funny because the messages that actually bothered me the most were people who would shoot me a message on a DM or email or whatever. And they'd be like, hey man, I saw what's going on. Like, I just want you to know that I support you privately or whatever. And I'm like, well, what does that do for me? If you're not going to say anything publicly, why do I, I guess the thought is nice, but it's like at the end of the day, if nobody's going to say anything, well, that doesn't really help me much. That one of the I really want to do. I really want to. I'm going to get back to what you just said before.
Yeah.
But the thing you mentioned about there being obvious answers to things, like all of us should want to make more money, or have our children make more money, or have the careers aligned. I think some of the saddest stuff that I read. You're familiar with the super tragic drownings of a lot of the people down in Kerr County, a lot of children when that flood happened. I went back and I watched and then read through a lot of the transcripts of some of the hearings. I think it was Kerr County or whatever, when they were talking about I think it was the American Rescue Plan funds.
Yeah.
And they had millions and millions of dollars sitting in these accounts. And this is a lot of money that we're talking like small, like population, I think like 5,000 towns. Okay. So lots of money for these towns. And they didn't want to spend the money because they were worried that if they spent it, it would give Biden the right to come and steal their homes, or it would give the federal government the ability to like enforce DEI on their policing force or whatever. It stopped. And this was like some of the most no strings attached money. Like it was just sitting in a bank account to be spent on whatever they wanted it to be spent on. And one of the things that I worry about, and this gets into a very kind of like politically elite question, is like, do you ever wonder if maybe it would be good sometimes if less people were interested in this topic, because so many people have become interested in it who just don't have the interest of like the actual topic at mind, but more of it's just another battlefield for politics to happen on.
And that's why I was talking about like, let's not politicize education. And that sounds Pollyannish. But no, you're absolutely right. That's an example. That's sad. If in fact there were dollars there that were attributed to Biden, we can't use Biden dollars or else it's going to make us look bad. Or
people don't understand with FEMA funds.
We're going to piss off the right. We're going to piss off. That's crazy. It's very similar to, when we were distributing $190 billion in ARPA, right? Rescue Plan dollars for schools. The goal was academic recovery, mental health support, and getting your facilities to the point where you can reopen schools while the pandemic is there. A lot of people forget. It was not closed during the Biden administration. They were reopened during the Biden administration.
Oh my God, yeah.
46% of our schools were open full time when I became Secretary of Education on March 2nd, 2021. 46% of our schools were open full time.
If I had $1 for every time somebody talked about how Biden shut all the schools down.
By November, we had 97% of the schools open. Those ARPA dollars were distributed in March of 2021. There was a state, I'm not even going to name it because I'm honestly. There was a state, you had a certain amount of time to start using those dollars. And it was like the last week. There were kids suffering. There were kids not in school. There were kids not getting the support that they needed. They did not use the dollars because this person had a governor that had national ambitions. And they didn't want to use those dollars. They were the last state to use it. And they did use it before the deadline. But it was because I was nudging, my department was nudging, hey, there are kids in your state that need help right now. You're reading, there's kids that use the dollars to help kids. They did, because the headline would have been bad, that there's money, sitting in coffers while kids are struggling and families are struggling. But that's the culture that this division is creating in our country. And we got to rise above that.
When you look at where you place kind of the responsibility for the political climate right now and how everything is so clipped and consumed and made for entertainment consumption, I guess, for the public, are you looking at kind of being upset with the public, the culture, kind of like the DC people, the mainstream media, alternative media? How do you factor all of this in your mind when you're like, this is like frustrating me?
Now this takes 0% of my education training or my degrees. So I'm just a person with an opinion here, right? I think it sells, right? It sells. Nobody was going to turn on a TV to hear about how the $190 billion went to feed kids, provide reading teachers for kids that were struggling, help incentivize people getting into the profession. Nobody's going to run a piece on 60 Minutes about how an increase in Pell Grant gave this child an opportunity to be a first-generation college student. That doesn't sell. So there's an aspect there. There are people whose political career thrives on division and creating fear-mongering. So there's the political element there. And I think, and and I say this respectfully, but DC, when you're in the bubble, you think your impact is greater than it really is, right? So you think people in rural, Nebraska care what you think more than they really do. They're just trying to make ends meet. So there's this bubble there where it's almost self-absorbed, right? And their talking points, they think that the whole world is listening. It's really not. So it's that self-aggrandizing in DC. There's the media component where people are not going to tune in if it's not creating fear or division or clickbait. There's that. And then there's people whose career is defined by thriving off this turbulence that they create, right? It's like the person that wants to be a firefighter starting a fire so they could put out the fire and be the hero. There's a little bit of that as well. I don't know. And again, that's just my opinion. That took 0% of my what I went to school for, my experience. So I want to be very clear that that's just me speaking as a consumer of the media. Somebody
One a victim
observing.
to some extent as well.
Yeah,
right?
and then of one. That's it.
Do you want to take a couple minute break?
Yeah, let's do that. Let me refill my
sure.
H2O.
Cool. Okay, yeah. One thing that is kind of frustrating to me is there were indicators. So you keep bringing this thing up about it's not red or blue, it's green.
Yeah.
And one thing that's kind of frustrated me as the political conversations have changed so much is it seems like there were some things that were just like good indicators of everybody's successful to now people are willing to make compromises on what should be like universal indicators of success for some political agenda. So focusing this in, so conversation topic is very popular in my industry field or whatever, has to do with college. And there's this weird feeling sometimes of like this, do you know Mike Rowe?
Heard the name.
This Mike Rowe-esque idea of you have real jobs that are like construction and building things and doing stuff with your hands, and then you have like fake BS jobs, which is like being at a computer, being a nerd, being a loser. And even if these jobs pay significantly less, there's like more nobility in them. And I'll say on the other end, I absolutely do not think you should ever talk down to, besmirch, look down on, patronize, condescend to anybody that does blue collar work or working class stuff. We need these jobs and we need people to work them, and they're an essential part of this country functioning. But all the same, the idea that you would besmirch college as like leading to these fake jobs, and we don't need our kids doing that. We need our kids going to trade school as a common one. It is very frustrating to me. What are your thoughts, I guess, on that kind of cultural divide?
Again, we're spending time responding to a narrative that's being created for us, and that's the part that really gets to me. Because as a former teacher and educator, I see the value in both. Right, a lot of people don't know this, but when I was like 13 years old, I was in middle school. I had to think about high school, right? I had an older cousin, and I come from a large Puerto Rican family, a lot of cousins, right? My eldest cousin went to this trade school to learn how to become a plumber. And kind of like little ducks following their mother duck across the street, all the cousins went to the same school. So I went to a technical high school, Wilcox Tech, loved it, great experience. I was learning how to fix cars for 4 years. Then a teacher tapped me on the shoulder and said, Miguel, you should consider becoming a teacher. And that's how I got into the teaching profession. She saw something in me that I didn't see, and that's why I'll always fight for public schools. It was a trade school, but it was a public school. Teachers that really see potential in students. It's always been my goal to recognize that students need to have options when they graduate. Part of the work that I'm doing now, I'm really focusing on helping create pathways between K-12 and higher ed. And saying both and. I think what you're defining is an attack on higher education, whether that's cutting the research dollars, saying that they're all woke institutions, or saying that, you don't need that. The reality is college graduates make on average $1 million more over the course of their career than students with a high school degree. Just facts, right? And that, yes, we do need blue collar jobs, and we do see in advanced manufacturing and cybersecurity, and you see a lot more manufacturing jobs and trade jobs being needed as we're building made in America, making things in America. That's both sides of the aisle agree that that's where we're going. So there's a greater need now for those careers that could then lead to a 4-year degree, right? So the President Biden worked really hard for the infrastructure bill, bipartisan. Doesn't get a lot of credit for that, but bipartisan infrastructure bill. You see all the work that's happening across our country? There's signs that say project was paid for by, right? And I can tell you there's a cabinet meeting where I was sitting.
By what? Where were you going to finish that sentence?
By the infrastructure plan.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Yeah,
Bipartisan.
Trump has put his name on a lot of those signs.
No, but listen to this.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Bipartisan infrastructure plan. And the reality is,
Yeah.
I can tell you, I know it in Connecticut. It may be the same across the country. Those signs say this was paid for by bipartisan infrastructure. The word bipartisan was really important to President Biden when I was at the cabinet meeting when he was talking about it. And there was also a part there that said Joseph Biden, president. If you look at those signs, that part was cut out. Mm-hmm. But my point in saying that is that there are high skill, high paying careers right now that don't require a 4-year degree. And our schools are not really designed to help students have access to that. We don't have enough internships. We don't have enough of that. Micro-credentialing, skill development. But when you have a bridge project, you're going to need folks that are going to be running the cement, running the lines, laying down the foundation. You're also going to need architects. You're going to need engineers. So 4-year degrees are also needed. I think there's a division that was created there that's unnecessary. Part of the work that I'm doing now with Cardona Solutions is closing those gaps and making sure that we're not putting a hierarchy, but saying they're all needed. Because you could have all the 4-year degrees you want. If you don't have people that are doing some of the blue collar work, those degrees are not going to come into use because you're not going to have the labor that you need. And as a tech school graduate, I understand the value of that. But I also don't like the fact that we put a fork in the road that doesn't need to be there. In Connecticut, the example that I give is we have schools that are training students how to weld. 18-year-old kids going to make $60,000, $70,000 when they get out of school. No college debt. They go back for a 2-year degree that the employer pays for to learn how to code. Now they're coding machines that weld. They're making well over $100,000 a year without any college debt. That's happening across our country. We need to do a better job connecting our K-12 and higher ed to get that done. Mm-hmm. That's the work that I'm doing with Cardona Solutions. And really, that's a purple issue, man. And those are the type of things that I think we need to be focusing on in education. That's just one example. Yeah. Access to higher education is another.
You mentioned this earlier, and you mentioned it a few times, this idea of, I think you said like options. And I'm a huge proponent. Unfortunately, I didn't finish college because I was working too much, but I'm a huge proponent of higher education, of college. That being said, I definitely recognize that when I was in school, I graduated in 2007, the message was like, you go to college or you're a loser. Mm-hmm. It is the only option for you.
For
if you don't go to college,
yep.
Exactly,
yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the most frustrating thing to me, I think like culturally, politically, sociopolitically, whatever, is this concept of like the pendulum, where it's like, I think that they went too far over here, so I'm going to be that stupid on this side. Yeah. And the idea of like, we shouldn't push everybody to 4-year institutions. I agree with that, but that doesn't mean they're bad. No. And it doesn't mean no one should go there. It doesn't mean everybody has to go to trade school. And even when it comes up in things, you bring up like different types of labor. You might need people with degrees. You might need people with that do blue collar work. And some people don't like the term blue collar or low skill or whatever. But even when it comes up for, say, immigration, people say, well, these people that are immigrating, these are low skill labor or whatever. And I was like, okay, do you think we don't need that? Yeah. Do you think that we don't have a shortage of all types of labor in this country? Like just because there is low skill labor, high skill labor, some requires more specialization, doesn't mean it's not needed. Like all of it is at the end of the day, we need all these workers. Yeah.
I think it's Colin Cowherd. He's a sports podcaster.
Okay.
He has a show, whatever. I listened to a show once, like 7 years ago. He said something that really stuck with me. He said, people like to live in a black and white world. I live in gray. That hit me. There's a lot of gray. And we like to go extreme, but there's gray. And to your point, I think that mentality of college or bust went too far.
Sure.
Right? And I think the opposite could be true too, that higher education is a farce. No, it's not. So those are the two extremes. I live in the gray. I do believe there are some programs, both in private institutions of higher ed and public institutions of higher ed, that need to evolve, where we're charging students $150,000 to get a degree in something where they're going to be making $35,000, $40,000 a year. That's crazy. That's not a good return on investment. during my time as Secretary of Education, I was going after those places. We were holding them accountable for these programs that are not worth the paper of the diploma that they get when they're done. So I think there has been a need for accountability in programming, transparency, our college scorecard. We work to make sure that they're transparent. Hey, parents, with some of the gainful employment work that we did over the last 4 years. Hey, parents, this is how much the degree is going to cost. And this is how much debt you're going to end up in, typically, if you go to this school. And this is how much money your child is going to make when they graduate. And this is what their starting income is. I think all parents should get that information so that they can make good decisions. And there are some programs, both in for-profit institutions and in public institutions, that really have run their course and are not needed. You don't need a 4-year degree to do something, and you don't need kids to be in debt where they can't buy a home or they can't put their kids through college because of the college loans that they have. So I think both can be true, that there are some programs that are, the return on investment is not good. But I think it's wild to think that we want to throw out the whole higher education system and that it is not needed. That's absolutely false.
I think some of the most frustrating things to me when I look at that issue too is that sometimes it feels more, you used this term bridging earlier, that sometimes it just feels like a bridging problem where there will be all the resources on this side and nobody even knows that they exist. And there are so many people that, I'll see these complaints about, I've got $60,000 of student loan debt. And I was like, that's a lot of, you're like twice the average of people that need to borrow. And I'd be like, well, what's going on? And so many of these conversations start with, so I went to an out-of-state private school, and I was like, why? and so many, and not to, my audience hates me on these days because they're a little bit younger, so a lot of them have student loan debt. But it's like, there will be so many students where it's like, you have an electrical engineering degree. You didn't need to go to halfway across the country and acquire so much that you could have did an in-state school. Yeah. And we're not even talking about, 2 years at a community college or anything else. Just like an in-state school would have saved you 90% of the cost on this. Yeah.
Let's talk about student debt a little bit. Like, everybody, the headlines were, debt relief. And something I'm proud of is close to $190 billion in debt relief, right? And if you look at it, who are these people that got debt relief? Veterans, educators, nurses, people with total and permanent disability got debt relief. People that were defrauded by these for-profit institutions that have really fancy commercials and nice flyers, but they don't educate for a lick, right? They're closed down, So
Trump University.
I'm
sorry.
I was waiting. You notice I paused, waiting for you to jump in there.
Oh, you're good. You got it.
So for me, it was about making sure that the return on investment was there. I agree with you, and part of my focus as secretary, I went to state colleges, right? I got I went to K-12 public schools in Connecticut. I went to Central Connecticut State University. I always say I walked in with an imposter syndrome and I walked out with a future. And then I went to UConn for my grad work. And I'm a product of K-12 public education and state schools. And I was able to advise the President of the United States. And, my story shouldn't be a counterexample. That's happening across the country, right? I do agree that we have to be more transparent with how much you're going to end up in debt. But I also think we got to fix the damn loan system. We tried to introduce SAVE. So a lot of people forget. They just miss the fact that over 1 million people were going into default every year. That's crazy. We set out to fix the problem. We said we're going to do an income-driven repayment plan that doesn't require you to make decisions on, do I, grow a family? Do I buy a home? Do I get groceries? Or do I have to put $900 a month on this plan where I'm paying mostly interest? So we said we're going to fix the problem. We're also going to create transparency in colleges, hold them accountable, and we're going to make sure that if you choose public service, I said a little while ago, teachers make 24% less than people with similar degrees in other professions. If you choose public service, you work for...
What? It's dropped. Looks like it's back up now. Okay. Sorry, keep going. If you choose public service, yeah.
I said, if you choose public service, you work for 10 years in public service, you pay your loans for 10 years, your loans are forgiven. That was signed by a Republican president. in bipartisan fashion. So we were working on fixing a broken system to make higher education more affordable, more accessible. Not saying don't do higher ed, but let's make sure that there's a better return on investment. Your generation, I feel bad. Like I have a young a nephew who's like 25 years old. He's an educator. His wife is an educator. They're buying their first home. They're going to be in debt for a minute. Why the hell are we making it harder for them to grow a family? We need to fix what's broken, while not saying higher education shouldn't be an option. But we have to make it more accessible, and we have to make it more affordable. And that's the bottom line. And I think both sides of the aisle would agree on that. The problem is that they're not coming together to say, this is how we could do it in a way that's reasonable.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of like infected every aspect of our lives, I guess, governmentally.
Yeah.
And that because so much has become part of, I call it a constellation of beliefs, that if you are kind of like bought in at one segment of the political discourse, you get sucked into 50 million other points. So if for whatever reason, if you eat healthy, you might read the wrong set of tweets or YouTube videos, and now you're starting to watch RFK stuff, and now you don't trust like the public health system, and now you think that like DEI and trans is bad, and now you think colleges are poisoning students. And it's really frustrating because sometimes it feels like when I go to argue on any of these points, like if I try to argue to a person, your child would probably be better served in a four-year university. It would be really good for them. The thing that I have to fight against is I need you to convince me that the entire government is not set up to destroy my family's life when I know that they've been involved in 450 million horrible things, from fluoridating the water to shutting down schools for no reason to killing us with COVID and then to killing us with the and it's like that's a lot to work through. Yeah.
So we've been algorithmically conditioned. I like metaphorical reasoning, right? So if you think about, everybody knows how you turn on a social media and there's an algorithm that puts in your face things that you're more likely to consume, right? And if you look at your For You page, it's going to be based on your history, right? And what you like. I think the same is true with media. I think the same is true with what we choose to pick up and read. It's just reinforcing an algorithm. Who you talk to, which podcast you listen to. That tells me all that I need to know about you from A to Z, which is crazy.
Yeah.
But that's where we are. I worked for President Biden. It was the honor of a lifetime. That means that for a lot of the population in this country, whatever comes out of my mouth is bad. So that's where we are right now. So I tell people, when I was fortunate to serve as a resident fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School in their Institute of Politics. And I would tell the students there, I didn't care what, Republican or Democrat. I'm like, my generation kind of screwed it up for you, but I have more confidence in your generation that you could be better consumers than my generation is. And I really believe that moving forward, we have to find a way, not just to have a good message, but to communicate it in a way that cuts through that. How do we do that? Part of the question was for us as resident fellows in the beginning was, how do you make it so that you're not contributing to the partisanship that exists in this country?
Yeah.
And that's why, when I was invited here, I'm like, man, this is probably a way for people to see me. A long form podcast is more than 90 seconds that Jake Tapper's going to give me, or that, MSNBC will give me, or even Brett will give me on Fox. They get to hear the nuance, which you miss in some of those other platforms. And when we get to that, that's where I think the labels will kind of go away. Because, Miguel said something that I disagree with, but I did agree with what he said over here. And I'm willing now to have a conversation because I'm not going to typecast him into the labels that walk into the room before he does.
Hopefully, yeah. One of the big challenges that I've had in trying to navigate the media environment that's kind of emerged or mutated over the past few years is there's a desire sometimes where there are certain things where it's like, this should be as apolitical as possible. what should the child vaccine schedule look like in our country, or what's the best approach to K through 12 and higher education. Like, you should be as apolitical as possible. And one frustrating thing I have sometimes, and it might come from members of government in the cabinet, it might come from educated people, from researchers, from people or whatever else, I'll find that there are a lot of people who are on, I'll say, more politically aligned with me. And I admire this. And there are times where I have this feeling of like they want to come at this as from an apolitical, like I just want to talk about the facts, let's do that. And then on the other side, they're very much like, I'm ride or die on this, and I don't care, whatever. I'm going to deny what's over here just because they're on that side politically, so I have to be on this. And there's this weird reality now where you've got this whole base of, I'm putting media in huge air quotes, you're kind of like your Joe Rogans, your Candace Owens, or whatever, where they take on this role sometimes of like the centristy person, and an ordinary person who's not well-versed or educated in these topics, which I wouldn't expect them to be because there's so much to know about so much stuff. They take a look at these two sides and like, okay, well, the truth must be like somewhere in the middle. And it's like, well, this person over here is trying to be as politically partisan as possible. This person here is trying to be sometimes as apolitical as possible. The truth is not really in the middle, but then if you say that, you have the impression of being, this guy over here. And I run into this thing, and I used to play this. I'm more combative now with conservatives, and I used to play more of like, I'm the nice liberal, like I'm talking to Ben Shapiro, and I'm going to be very cordial and nice and everything. But
I thought you were.
Well,
nice.
Yeah, because you're on my side politically. No, I'm just kidding. But the issue that you run into is sometimes I got this feeling of, when I talk to conservatives and I look at the comment sections afterwards, I would see this thing over and over again. Wow, what a nice conversation. Wow, what a pleasant conversation. Wow, what a nice conversation. It's like, okay, well, can you talk about the conversation rather than the fact that we just had the conversation? Or two, if I get quoted, and I hated this, and as a white person, I don't experience this, but I've heard from different minority friends this feeling of like when you're the only black person in a group of white people, you're the only woman in a group of men, that it feels weird sometimes to criticize your own in that group because you end up taking on this weird role where I would be like the liberal who would come out and it's like, well, Destiny says, Steven says that these liberals are stupid on this point and that point and that point. It's like, well, that was one thing I said because I was trying to get you to listen to me, but you didn't hear anything else.
That's no different than my hearings where they just Twitter farm,
Yeah.
Look, I do that when I speak to leaders, different parts of the country, whether it's K-12 leaders or higher ed leaders. I talk about leadership in 2026 and beyond. And I use Simon Sinek's model, the why, the what, and the how. And the why never changes, what we're about. The what always changes, right? In education, AI, pathways, whatever. The what changes. The how is where the innovation lies. How you do the work is the leadership challenge moving forward. How do I communicate in a way that doesn't typecast me into one thing? How do I bring in people that, as you said, are on different levels of the continuum of, I don't believe you because you have a D next to your name, or because you're Latino, or because you're from Connecticut, or from, you were part of the Biden team. The how is a leadership challenge. So I argue, and I said this when I was secretary, intentional collaboration has to be part of the strategy. I have to bring people that disagree with me on a lot of things to the table and be open about having them at the table when we're talking about something that we agree on. Or else I'm going to be ignored by 50% of the population in this country. That has to be part of my leadership strategy. Some would say you're selling out. And some would say, well, that person is not, Republican enough. Who cares? You're always going to have haters. You have to be intentional in your how. And I believe, going back 5 years, the reason why I got called by President Biden was not because I put money in his campaign, never put a dollar in his campaign. Not because I wasn't known across the country. I wasn't one of the names in education that people knew about. It was because we reopened schools in Connecticut with intentional collaboration that brought people with different perspectives to the table so that their fingerprints are on our plan to reopen schools. And we were able to reopen schools quickly. So this intentional collaboration with people that you don't agree with is going to bring you fire from the opposition and from people on your side. But that's the leadership challenge of 2026, is to say, no, we're going to be intentional about it. We're not going to be stupid about it either. But you know, if I just hang out with people that agree with me, that's group polarization. I'm just contributing to the problem. And I think, yeah, you know, that's kind of where I've evolved in terms of how I want to do business moving forward. Doesn't mean I'm going to compromise my values, but I have to make sure that I can't only speak to my audience, or else I'm going to miss half the country.
Yeah.
And I just think we got to lose sight of. Sometimes we're losing sight of that in the work that we do. It's easier to talk to people that agree with me.
One more question directionally. I'm not trying to be too doomer. So
No, man.
one of the things I guess that's really frustrating to me is I have so much admiration for when Biden came in, he really tried. He did the bipartisan Congress thing to an absurd, even progressives, even very far left people were like, I didn't think he would get that much done. And then his rhetoric was always, I'm a president for all Americans. You know,
Yeah.
the only thing they attacked him with was the narrow cut of the speech with the red background for 4 years is all they attacked him with because they couldn't find anything else. And even that speech was cut up. And so there was no gamesmanship with FEMA funds or anything like that. There were no messages to states of, you know, you have to play ball or else you're not going to get emergency funds. And I feel like he tried so hard, not tried so hard, he accomplished so much in terms of this bipartisan, you know, working together to get stuff done. And then to see everybody just forget it. And like when I hear, you know, I don't know how involved you are in like criminal justice stuff, but when I hear people say things like that was a weaponized DOJ, there are so many people, me included, who are like, I wish. And it's like, when you see how much they tried to do the, you know, like we're bipartisan, like we're working together with everybody. I'm a president for all Americans. You know, we're gonna do everything as fairly as possible. And then people still have this impression of, no, that was the most corrupt admin ever. And it's like, man, really? What is the way? Do you have a feeling on like what is the way forward? Where do we go from here? What does the next admin look like? Like, what do we kind of like push? What direction are we pushing in to try to not have that repeat?
I love that question. I sat in the Oval Office. I sat in the cabinet meeting room, both when the cameras were on and when we pushed them out. And I can tell you how, you know, there were people that felt it was too much. He was adamant. And some of us on the cabinet were like, how are you going to work with these folks? They're burning you. And he was adamant. And he held us accountable to make sure that red states were, not that we were fighting it, but that red states got support too, that we lifted up examples. You know, and he would joke, you know, it's funny, they voted no for the money to go to their state, but they're there at the ribbon cutting when the new
every time
facility was being opened or when the new bridge or the new jobs were being created. But he said his mentality was like, we're still going to do it. We're still going to do it. We're not going to hold them, you know, we're not going to, because he was trying to restore the soul of a nation, right? And I would argue, yeah, we're seeing the opposite now, but that didn't unhappen. I never bet against the American people. I can bet against politicians. I'll never bet against our educators. I believe in public education. I don't like what's happening now. I don't like the division. I despise, I see the undoing of policies that brought people together. But to this day, you know, one of the things I respect about President Biden is he brought 50 years of DC politics. He was a senator. He thought like a senator. He thought about both sides, right, of the aisle. And he gave people meetings even though they were burning them. Right? He did that intentionally because he knew that the American people they're not as partisan as DC is, and they want people just to work for them. You know, and you're right. But there was a lot of bipartisan work done that we're going to see the benefits of, right? There's a lot of undoing of it now, but there was, and I still believe that mentality exists. Right now, you don't see it because we are in extreme times. But I do believe moving forward, this country will rebuild. This country will reimagine. I don't even like to use the word rebuild because it shouldn't go back to what it was. We need to reimagine what it looks like. And I'm hopeful that in 2028, in 2026, it'll be the beginning of it. We're going to see a country that hopefully the pendulum doesn't swing just back the other way where now colleges and K-12 institutions are going to get, oh, does that mean we're going to get 4 years of this and then we have to undo it in another 4 years? That's hurting the American people. I hope that this next wave can usher in a a period where we say we got to learn from how partisan hurt the American people. I really do believe that. And that's what I want to be a part of helping build, right? Education system that it doesn't matter who's sitting in the chair in DC. We're going to work to give kids opportunities. We're going to give kids opportunities to higher education. We're going to give them support for mental health when they need it. We're going to treat every child with dignity, whether they're a transgender child or a student that is Republican that doesn't, feel that was a part of the, opposition in terms of public education or wanted vouchers. It doesn't matter. Every person in this country deserves to be respected. I do believe we are in an anomaly right now of partisanship that is really driven by the top. I can be bipartisan, but I will not support the BS that's happening in terms of, it's just crazy. These are rare times. And I hope to God, even in the Republican Party, that there's a sense of let's find common ground on the things we agree on and let's work together on it regardless. That the era that I served as Secretary of Education were Republican leaders who had good ideas and I agreed with them and I wanted to work with them didn't give me the time of day. I hope that era ends soon. Our students deserve that. Our families deserve that. Our country deserves that. And I'm here for it. And I know the folks that are listening right now are just tired of the BS in DC driving the narrative. We need to really bring it back to the people who are being hurt or helped by the policies that we create. And I'm hopeful, man. I'm not a pessimist. I'm an N of one. I talk about the N of one. My story. I grew up in an economically depressed community where 85% of the students currently are still free and reduced lunch. I went to a local elementary school that for many years under NCLB would have been labeled a failing school. I had public education teachers who didn't make what they were worth, but loved what they did, serving kids. And it was one of those teachers that saw something in me that I didn't see, that gave me a chance to think maybe I could go to college. I went to college. First in my family to go to college. We were still economically disadvantaged, but I still was able to make it to college. And then I got graduate degrees, and I had opportunities for me, and I was able to serve my community as an educator, as a school principal, as a district leader. I went on to serve as a commissioner of education, and then I got tapped on the shoulder by the president. That is the American story that drives me, that makes me an optimist. Yeah, there's problems, but damn it, I'm not going to sit back and let it fall apart. Public education is that great equalizer. It's under attack right now. That means we need to stand up in ways that stand up for it, because there's a bunch of Miguel Cardonas, 45 years ago that have only what their local neighborhood school provides. And damn it, I got so much from it that it's worthy for me to spend the rest of my years fighting to make sure that it exists. That my title changes, but the purpose doesn't, right? And I think across the country, we have educators that are showing up every day because they believe in that. And I'll be damned if one administration or a series of partisanship is going to take us away from what our country could achieve if we go back to that. That's kind of where I am, and that's what I believe.
There's a quote, I don't know who said it, but I kind of like it. For all the problems that America has, and we have no shortage of them, one thing you can say about America is that if you participate in American life, if you are an American, it allows you to become the best version of yourself.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I think that's definitely an important thing worth fighting for.
You are an example of a dream. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I want to bring it back to you now.
Okay.
You are the dreams of your grandparent, the Cuban that came over. He's making it. Look at this. My grandkid could do this in this country. That's the American dream. And so am I. Mm-hmm. And so are so many of, you know what I'm saying? So, we can't give up on that, man. It's ugly right now. It's partisan, but we cannot give up on that.
You mentioned vouchers a little bit. I'll say something you mentioned earlier. COVID really revealed a lot of the differences of environment for students.
Yeah.
From my son got, every student had iPads assigned to them that they could go home with. And then I remember hearing stories of some places where they would have to park, I don't know if they're real or not, I guess it sounds insane. Yeah, they have to park a bus or somewhere to get Wi-Fi to kids because they didn't have access to internet in the home. It's real. In your mind, I'm a discrete guy. I like data and studies and more than narratives. Whatever. That's just how I am. Yeah. There are a few policies that when I talk to people, there are two that I've heard of that are like, this is just, it's beyond question. One is air conditioner for schools. That like every degree lower is like, it's just, you need it for hot climate areas. And then the second is availability of food. These are just two non-negotiables. These are like your 80-20, like it's a little effort. It's easy. You pour money into it. This is like, will always give you a good return on investment. What's your feeling on like, what are those like easy things that we could do? And then coming back to the, like, what do you think about like the voucher idea that so many people like to push? Yeah.
Well, look, the $190 billion that 50% of Congress voted for, but 100% of the kids benefited from. Mm-hmm.
And 100% of the politicians took advantage of, generally speaking,
academic recovery, mental health support for kids, and improving facilities. I remember walking into Philadelphia at school. The air handling system, forget air conditioning, the air handling system that puts fresh air into the classrooms hadn't been serviced in decades because of funding issues. The rescue plan dollars allowed them to fix those systems that got the air handling going, that made teachers feel more comfortable walking into a school when there were no vaccines, there were no tests. None of that was there. So that we're talking about the air handling system. Classrooms in the Northeast that don't have air conditioning get up to 90 degrees, 95 degrees, 100 degrees in June when kids are expected to be in school. And we wouldn't let corporate America wouldn't allow that for their employees we let our kids go into schools like that, and nobody blinks about that. That's the norm. I remember being a school principal and on those days having to alternate like 15, 20 different classrooms into the media center because they had air conditioning at 30-minute increments so that the kids are not overheating and dehydrating. So my teachers, many of them are 60, 65-year-old teachers, I worried about their health. This is happening in our countries, in our classrooms across the country, and no one bats an eye at that. So, yeah, it makes common sense. Now, you talk about meals. I remember I was a school principal in 2003. I remember teachers going grocery shopping for their classrooms so that their kids had snacks, so that they can have a snack mid-morning because they were starving. The only warm meals they're getting are in the classroom, are in the schoolhouse. That's a reality across our country. And you mentioned the COVID making the gaps wider. Absolutely. 4 weeks into COVID, I called a superintendent in Connecticut of a very wealthy district, like your scenario. Everybody had an iPad. Parent was home. They had Wi-Fi. No issues. I called the superintendent of a very poor community. 4 weeks into COVID, she's still looking for her kids. We haven't tracked them down yet. We're sending buses to the bus stops with food so that they could go and get food because that's and their parents are working because their parents work at, dry cleaners, or their parents are working in jobs where you don't show up, you don't get paid. Mm-hmm. So the gaps got greater. That's a reality in our America today. And part of the work we tried to do in the first several months of our administration was close those gaps by providing those ARPA dollars. Rural America, mostly red, suffered the most. They're still suffering the most from the policies that are being passed right now. When summer school goes away for rural students, that's all they have, right? When you talk about vouchers, rural America, you don't see independent schools popping up in rural America. They have only what their public schools could provide, right? So when we starve Title I dollars, those rural communities are not going to have the summer school programs. They're not going to have the after school programs. So, it's all connected. And I would say that, yes, let's start with the things that make sense. Let's feed kids. Let's make sure that our facilities are places where we would want to walk into, as opposed to putting our kids on the third floor of a school in the sweltering heat. And your job is to keep them from dehydrating during the day. How do you expect your reading scores to go up if these kids are, dehydrating during the day? Like, come on, man, some common sense stuff. But it's common sense if you have a willingness to work together with people that think ideologically differently than you. And I think we've stepped away from that. We need to take care of that first. The technical things are simpler. It's the mindset right now in this country where if you have an R next to your name, if you have a D next to your name, I can't work with you. That's what we got to fix. That's where I am.
I agree. I agree with that. Part of my background, I guess, when I went to college was for music. And this is a random. Have you seen the movie Whiplash?
Have I what?
Have you seen the movie Whiplash?
No.
Oh man, okay. This is a crazy jazz
I will
instructor. He's a terrible person, but he does a lot of crazy things. But there's at least one thing you've seen in every band director from him. But one of the things that you learn, and you learn this with everything, is that if you can't identify the problem, can you hear that you're out of tune? Well, you can't change it if you can't hear it.
Right.
And so much of like problem solving begins with problem identification. And sometimes people forget that step or they skip it. And it's like, well, if we don't even agree on what the problem is, how are we going to solve it? And the sad thing is that sometimes, oftentimes maybe, or at least with some things, oftentimes, the solving is actually pretty easy. It's just getting people to agree
all day
that there's a problem there.
All day. Yeah. It's not hard to address the gap between K-12 education and higher ed. We just have to agree to sit down at the table. That's why I said the innovation is in the how, not in the what.
Yeah.
Right? So, absolutely. And, I like you more now knowing that you're a band kid because, as an educator, I felt one of the things that helped heal our country were the bands, the music programs in our schools. Those kids just needed to be together. And it brought normalcy when we were coming out of the pandemic, hearing bands, Friday night, the students in the bands. And for me, a lot of improvement is kind of like jazz. It's improvisation. What's happening? How do we react to the issues, and how do we improvise to make sure that we can move to problem solving? A lot of it right now is making sure that we could talk to each other, making sure that we could create a band together in order to create the beautiful music. We are choosing not to work together based on, I think is by design, division that has been manufactured in this country.
Another frustrating thing on that point, I get so many emails from people who work FBI, CIA, like people who do like intelligence stuff. I get military emails. I've gotten emails from educators, from nurses and doctors. One of the overwhelming things that I see in public service that I feel like is just so disconnected from the American population is 99.99% of the people that have these types of jobs really just love the country. They want to serve the country. They want to make the country a better place. These are not glorious jobs where they're making billions of dollars. And to see so many people, I can't imagine the feeling of like, I'm already earning less than I would if I was in the private sector, and everybody thinks I'm an actual Satan-spawned demon trying to destroy their everything. And it's like, I'm standing between you and oblivion. I can't imagine the frustration of every single... I remember when... The Republicans tried to spin this, I think, as like that people were making random, or that the police were arresting parents complaining about schools or something, but it was like people were calling in bomb threats or something on some of these school meetings. It was insanity to me. And it was this idea that it sucks that like, if I make a decision and it's the wrong decision, I think COVID was so much of this, okay? I think there was so much amazing conversation that still today could be had about prospectively, did we make the right choices locking down? Could we have made better choices? Could we have opened schools? Like how many different things could we have done? But those conversations can't happen when they start with, okay, well, I wanted what's best for my kid and you wanted to kill everybody. So let's start from there. And it's like, well, Jesus.
That group polarization is something that we really need to, but we all have bias.
Sure.
We all have to recognize our bias when we walk in the door.
But I think you have to recognize, and I tried, in the past I had those, I don't know as much anymore, but like, well, even today with the average person, not with the media figures I tell, but it's like, I have to believe that you want what's best for our kids. But I need you to believe that I also want what's best for our kids. And we have to start from there, because we can't start with thinking that one of us wants them all dead, because we can't have any common ground. It's just a fight at that point.
And the crazy thing, and I want to get back to vouchers, but I want to talk about public service loan forgiveness, because I think that's a good example of what you're just saying, right? When we think of debt relief, Biden debt relief, he's handing out money to the, let me tell you what we did with public service loan forgiveness. There were only 7,000 people prior to us coming in that got it. Public service loan forgiveness, it was passed in bipartisan fashion in 2007, signed by a Republican president. You work 10 years in public service, you pay your loans for 10 years, your loans will be forgiven. That's to increase the number of public servants, because we know they're not getting paid what they would be getting paid in the private sector. They do it because they love it. So 10 years passed, 2017. From 2017 to 2021, only 7,000 people get public service loan forgiveness. I believe there were obstacles put in the way on purpose. We come in, we said we're going to fix the system. In 3 years, we got 1 million people to get public service loan forgiveness. So, billions of dollars going to public servants, teachers, nurses, police officers, firefighters, military folks, civil servants. And people are like, oh, you're giving money out to me. No, this is an example. I was in New York. I was talking to an educator who told me I got $20,000 in debt relief. So the money that I was going toward paying my loans allowed me to fix up my bathroom in my apartment, 20-year teacher, in my apartment in New York, so that my disabled husband can finally go into the bathtub with dignity. I had another educator tell me, I was so thankful for the, $15,000 in debt relief that I got, that instead of paying that loan off now, I can get into an apartment, because now that money's going to go to an apartment where my son, this teacher's been teaching over 15 years, my son no longer has to sleep in a walk-in closet. Is that too much to ask? So when we humanize the work that we're doing, it lowers the temperature and removes some of that partisanship. When we say, who wouldn't want a teacher that's been teaching for 15 years in New York to have an apartment where their child doesn't have to sleep in a closet? Because they're making, 25% less than somebody with a similar degree in another profession, right? So there's that. Now, that's public service loan forgiveness. When we humanize it, when we bring stories, and I think maybe I'm even guilty of this. I talked in billions. Oh, we're doing billions here. Nobody cares about that. Tell me about the story of the American. I don't know if that person was Republican or Democrat. I don't care. That teacher deserves to have dignity so her husband can take a bath being disabled with dignity.
Especially because, and it's crazy because we don't think about this as Americans, but they really are some of the most important people in our entire society. There are so many people that I've met, and now you're among them, I was on a path in life, and I had one random teacher in high school, in grade school,
that believed in you, man.
Turned me on to some subject that completely changed the trajectory of this person's life. And some of these people are even getting emails where it's like, can we do the thing where every student brings in 2 boxes of tissues or whatever? And it's like, man, the school doesn't provide this.
That's crazy.
The teacher has to beg, and it's like that's. Yeah,
I was buying my own copy paper.
Yeah, that's insane to me. Yeah.
And that's the thing. Like, we called them essential employees 5 years ago. Now it's like. So we want Finland results. We don't put in the Finland investments. Let's go to vouchers real quick.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna put in a nutshell the experience that I had when I was secretary. I was winding down my time. I think it was in Indiana. I was talking to a superintendent who said, I have a limited budget. I'm worried about being able to provide the basics. I need reading teachers. My kids are not reading at the level that they need to be reading, right? But because of the voucher program, I have to take $12 million out of my budget and give it toward scholarships or vouchers for independent schools. That happened.
Can I just real quick so people understand? So the way that in case you don't know, so for the voucher system, my understanding is that your property taxes basically go towards funding your particular schools, but a voucher doesn't just let you take your kid and put them in a different school, sometimes a private school. It also takes away the tax dollars, I think, that public school would get otherwise.
Right.
Okay, yeah.
To simplify, here's the education budget. This superintendent had, and this budget was, working to make sure all kids can read on grade levels, so on and so forth, have meals, safe. They had to take $12 million out of that budget. So now they're operating with $12 million less. And the $12 million went toward the vouchers where parents could choose to go to independent schools, private schools, whatever. And there's nothing wrong with parents choosing to send their kids to private schools. Nothing wrong with that. Choice is amazing. I had choice. I went to a technical high school. But don't take it away from the public education dollars. That's my fight. So that district, $12 million had to go to a voucher program. In that same school system that I'm talking about, that superintendent told me that, I talked to a principal who said, I had less money now in my budget because the superintendent had to give $12 million to this other thing. I had less budget, and what ended up happening is after the students who were given the vouchers went to those private schools, after the attendance was taken on October 1st was when you do the rolls to see how many students you have in your schools. The parents of the students with disabilities were told, you know what, our school can't meet your child's needs. You have to send them back, or you should send them back to the public school because they have special education over there. The money didn't go back to the public school, but the student went back. So basically, you're giving choice for a lot of these independent schools to choose which kids they want to take. It's harder to educate. It's more expensive to educate children with disabilities, children that are not reading at grade level. So what you're doing is you're taking money from public education, money that was going to be for reading teachers, giving it to vouchers, and funding schools that can choose which students they accept. It costs more money to educate children with Down syndrome. It costs more money to educate children with autism. It costs more money to educate children with mental health or behavioral issues. So what ends up happening is those students end up coming back into the public schools, which will always serve them. But now they have less resources because those dollars were being sent for the vouchers for parents who would have sent their kids to those schools anyway, because in many cases they have those resources. That's happening across the country. And that, in a nutshell, is what I think public educators are worried about. The money that was intended to pay teachers or pay for reading programs or pay for after-school programs is now being funneled to vouchers, and the independent and private schools can choose which students they want to take. That's fundamentally going to disrupt and damage public education in this country. And I worry about it, not as 50-year-old Miguel who had the role of a secretary, a commissioner. I worry about it for the 5-year-old Miguel that's walking into our public education system right now and only has what that public school could provide, which 85-90% of the students in our country have their local public school. We're eroding that in this country in the name of choice. Parents have choice. And I do believe in choice. And I do believe in accountability for our public education system. But when we're taking funding away and putting it in schools, we're eroding that core of what's responsible for making this country grow.
Yeah. I think selling it on the conservative end too, you mentioned school as being ideally the great equalizer. On a conceptual level, the voucher thing, it feels to me like it actually hurts a bit of the meritocratic part as well, to where we should all want a student that has the ability to excel, to be able to excel as much as possible.
Right.
Or at the very least, it should never, ever be like the facilities or the school that is holding the child back. That should never be the case. And the idea, I think sometimes when it comes to voucher stuff, there's something that hurts deeply of the idea that like a 5 or 6 year old through no fault or benefit, like they haven't done anything to deserve it, or one way or another, that this child could already be behind because they've gone to a school system that's been pilfered, that's been vouchered out or whatever. Yeah. And it's like, man, why would we?
Race or place should not determine your ability to achieve. And I shouldn't be a counterexample. I went to an economically disadvantaged community. I went to a school, and I was still given the opportunity. So it's not to say that all the kids in this community can't. What we need to be saying is every child should be able to reach, and we need to have at least common denominator of what a good public education in this country looks like. Now, when you're taking apart the checks and balances at the federal level and removing the Office for Civil Rights and cutting all the people, the technical support at the federal level whose job it is to make sure that kids in rural America are getting a decent education. When you get rid of that, you're limiting the checks and balances that are designed to make sure that all kids in this country have access to quality education, right? Maybe it's not the Cadillac version, but they're getting a public education that can open doors for them. What you're doing is dismantling that so that the kids with resources or good lawyers have access to good education and everyone else has access to lower quality education. Now, I can say that and in the same breath tell you that I believe that we need to hold all schools accountable to high standards. I believe that the best way to improve our schools in this country is to make sure that every classroom has a highly qualified teacher in it. I'll stand by that all day. As a school principal, I knew the quality of teacher in the classroom matters more than anything else that I can control as a principal.
Yeah.
And we funded pipeline programs. We funded making sure, I can't control teacher salary from DC, but I can control what debt they're going to have if they've been serving for over 10 years. I can control funding pipeline programs. We went from zero states that had paid teacher apprenticeships to over 40 states with paid teacher apprenticeships in 4 years under the Biden team. Because we know that if we tell teachers, student teachers, we're not going to pay you for 4 months, but we want you to come into the profession, name another profession where you have to work for free for 4 months. That's crazy. And then we wonder why we have a teacher shortage. We created and supported paid teacher apprenticeships so student teachers could get paid so that they could get into the profession. That's real work to improve the profession so that we can get people in it. Now, you could talk about public education being bad and then be part of the problem that results in having substitute teachers floating around in most of our needy schools. Or, people don't want to teach in urban districts because they don't pay as much as their suburban districts. Like, let's get to the root of the issue. Let's talk about it. I'd love a Republican perspective. Let's talk about how we can come together on something that crosses the aisle to fix this problem that's happening in our. But what ends up happening is we cut the Office for Civil Rights in those communities that are urban because there's mostly Democrats there. That's crazy.
Yeah. The gamesmanship and the politicking of it is really annoying. I guess just a couple more questions. On a kind of a personal, professional level, so you've gone from being a fourth grade teacher to, I guess, inarguably the highest education spot in the country. Yeah. I'm just kind of curious, are there things that you thought as a teacher or even like, why does the principal do this? Or this is so dumb, or why does education work this way? That when you were the Secretary of Education, you're like, okay, I understand this now. And then once you're there, you're like, why can't teachers understand this? Or why can't principals understand that? Yeah, well, how did your understanding change of like top to bottom everything?
That's pretty funny. I always try to put myself in the perspective of my fourth grade teacher self when I was in DC. Mm-hmm. I had this theory that everybody loves coherence until it hits them. As a fourth grade teacher, I wanted all my students to follow pretty much the same rules.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
But I didn't want my principal telling me how to be a teacher.
Yeah.
And then when I was a principal, I'm like, you know what? If only all the teachers did similar things here, we'd be great. But damn, the superintendent is always telling me what to do. Just let me do my own thing. All the way through, right? As Secretary of Education, I recognized that principle and I said, look, I know as a secretary who has done all these different things, I would want A, B, C, D to be consistent throughout the country. But I remember when I was a commissioner, I didn't want the federal government telling me what to do. So what I ended up doing is trying to really listen to the field and say, these are best practices that are happening. And if Delaware could learn from Oregon and California could learn from, Rhode Island on best practices, we're going to have a sense of shared practices in a community of practice where we're learning from one another. And my job as Secretary of Education is to facilitate the learning, the growth, the sharing of ideas, the exchange of what works well. We're all trying to solve the same problem. We're just not talking to each other, right? That's the mentality that I brought to DC. So to answer your question, as Secretary of Education, I wished we removed barriers and said, who cares what state it's from? I need to learn about college and career pathways. I want to learn from that state that's doing it really well, regardless of what labels I put on them. That's what I wanted to see up and down the chain. You've heard the expression, the smartest person in the room is the room itself. Well, for me, it was really about bringing best ideas across the 50 states, regardless. I remember having summits at the White House. I would bring different, and I was very intentional. I talked about intentionality. I was very intentional about bringing the Commissioner of Education from a blue state and from a red state and putting them at the same table and having them talk about summer programming. Why? Because at the end of the day, we just want what's good for kids, right? So that would be the answer of not being the expert, whether I had the experience or not. I always say, whether you're an educator or a billionaire donor, your role as secretary is about bringing the best ideas together and making sure. So for me, that would be the thing. Not so much that I'm the expert, but that I bring the best ideas from across the country to the table, fund them, bring them to Congress and say, hey guys, look what they're doing over here. I don't care if it's a red or blue state. We need more of this. Can we fund this? Because they were the ones, they're the appropriators, right? And it was my job as Secretary of Education to make sure that the dollars get to where they're supposed to go and be used for what they're supposed to be used for.
Kind of on that note, so one thing I hear, and it's borne out evidentiarily, why do you think that, like for California, the UC school system is just so people have so many good things to say about it. That so many of the top schools are from California. When you look at higher education, I guess K through 12, I guess like what are one or two things where you're like everybody should learn from this state for this thing, and then it works because of this reason.
You know, and it's funny because this really crosses party lines. When you have a group of people and you see that work together, that are the why is very clear, and it's about helping students provide access and affordability and graduate and go on to contribute. When you have a group that big that's coming together around that shared why, it doesn't matter. I say build systems, not superheroes, right? So it doesn't matter who's leading it, although they have some great leaders there. The why is very clear throughout. Everybody hears about the Mississippi Miracle and reading, right? They had leaders there, tremendous leaders, that really focused on reading. We're just going to focus relentlessly on reading, and we'll get the why is very clear. When you have a shared why, all the other labels go away. And I think in education leadership, we have to remember our why. We have to lead with our why, not with our R or D, and be very clear about what the focus is. And when you can do that, you can cut through noise. And you have to be very explicit about it, unapologetic about it. For me, my why was addressing disparities in access and affordability in higher education. It was sharing that multilingualism is a superpower. And saying that, for many years in that bilingual program that I talked to you about earlier, where those kids felt like they were, is it because of those kids that our school's failing? No, those kids are bilingual. They have a superpower. They're bicultural. They can navigate, code switch from one culture to another. That's a gift. When we're talking about an economy that's all over the world, and these kids are going to be able to navigate different cultures and different languages, they have a superpower. They have a gift. Let's treat them as gifted and talented. For me, it's what is your why? How are you getting to it? And how are you being unapologetic about saying we're going to remove anything that's going to create barriers to us working together around this why? For me now, my why is making sure kids have access to higher education, making sure kids have access to college and career opportunities. For me, my why is talking to leaders and saying, look, this is the best time to serve as a leader when things are broken. It's our job to bring it back and reimagine what it could be. I talk to education leaders across the country, and they're tired, man. They're beat up. And I'm like, how lucky are you that you get to lead at a time when it's broken? You get to be the person that brings hope. You get to be, I wear a bracelet that was given to me by third graders a couple of years ago. It says good trouble. It reminds me that if we're not getting into good trouble, we're just protecting the status quo. It's our job to improve it. And yeah, it's going to be hard, but that's what we signed up for. We signed up for hard. Nobody signed up for a pandemic, but the best leaders showed up when it was hard. And this is where we are right now. So, that's what drives me right now. It's like, no, all right, leaders. Yeah, it's tough. Yeah. If you're a college leader right now, yeah, you're under attack. DEI is under attack. You got people cutting your funding. They need a good leader now. If you're a K-12 superintendent, yeah, you're dealing with partisanship. You're dealing with board meetings that are out of control because it's very political. It's your job as a leader to lead. And how lucky are we that we get to lead at a time where they need us now? It's easy to lead when things are easy. So for your generation and those that are coming up, I'm rooting for you, man. I believe you have the answers that we failed to provide because we became partisan, we became broken, we became cynical. And I do have hope that this next generation is tired of the BS. And they're like, damn it, you guys screwed it up. We're gonna do it our way. I really do believe that.
Sure.
We're gonna do it our way. And it's people like you that get audiences together to say, shit, we got to do things differently because the way that they did it before didn't work.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate the perspective of there's a problem, and a problem is an opportunity, theoretically. It can be, yeah. I guess last question related to work stuff, I guess. If you could give yourself one piece of advice, or if you could have imbued some knowledge on you the microsecond you walked in as secretary.
Yeah.
And I know as commissioner, you would have had practice before, but like, is there something that you wish you would have known immediately coming into the job that would have made things simpler? Or like, what was the most surprising part of the job where you're like, I wish I could have had this in mind earlier when I started for Secretary of Education?
I'm going to take this opportunity to complain a little bit.
Okay.
It took me like 9 to 10 months to get my lieutenants in.
Okay.
That was frustrating.
And those require Senate confirmation?
Senate confirmation. We had the House, we had the Senate, we had the White House. I couldn't get my lieutenants in to start doing debt relief. So we were, literally, there were like 15, 20, 30 people doing all the work. And it wasn't until I got, about 9 months in where I was able to get a comms assistant secretary. And even still, I never was able to get my assistant secretary for communications and it confirmed. So you're not walking in with a full deck. You're walking in with bits and pieces trying to make the work happen at a time where the country was shut down and we had to not only, reopen, but just make sure that kids were okay, right? And not to mention the most aggressive higher education accountability, debt relief agenda we've ever seen. We got all that done. I wish I knew walking in that it was going to take me 9 months to get all these people, because I would have been a lot more, I don't know. I mean, then again, I'm coming from Connecticut. I don't know how DC works. So thank God I had a tremendous team around me. I had some of the most talented people that understood. I hired people that knew the White House, that knew the Hill, that knew the Department of Education, and I hired people that knew the field. So I had a good mix of people when I did get people in to get stuff done. But it's always, you're walking in for the first time and you're like, okay, how does this place work? I was building relationships with, at the time, Jeff Science was leading the COVID response, right? So I had to, I knew my formula from Connecticut. I needed to work with Walensky, with Fauci, with Becerra, with the White House folks on coming together to say, no, this is how we're going to reopen schools. So I needed to know what CDC was going to come out with so that I could make sure my guidance was in lockstep. Left hand has to know what the right hand is doing. So it was all of that. We were aggressive and I think just even being more aggressive. Hindsight's always 20/20, but I thought we were aggressive, but kind of just being relentless in pursuing. If I knew we only had 4 years, I might have put some things in concrete and it's hard to tell, because this team, what they did was they're hell bent on just breaking everything.
Yeah.
Right? It's easy to break things. It's harder to rebuild. It's kind of like what we're seeing in Venezuela. It's easy to break things. Mm-hmm. How do you rebuild democracy?
There are a lot of truisms that are kind of said related to a lot of different things. And sometimes I think when somebody says a thing, I try to really sit and think, like, is this actually true? And one of the things I've come out for kind of recently is this defense of bureaucracy. Yeah. And I can kind of see it even in the current admin when, say, we're talking about some of these prosecutions failing because we don't know how to actually appoint prosecutors and get them confirmed. And it's like, maybe it's good sometimes to have people around that actually know how the system works and how to actually make things. Yeah.
It's crazy you say that, because I'm a big believer in, when I got there, look, I'm like, I don't want, this is a bureaucracy. I was a classroom teacher. I didn't know what the hell the federal government did. We're going to make it make sense. We're going to be a service agency, right? That was a big thing that I would tell my staff. We're going to be a service agency. But you dismantle the Office for Civil Rights. You're going to have civil rights issues for the next decade and no one to turn to at the federal level. Special education being moved to HHS. Okay. And don't get me wrong, restructuring is always something that we should be thinking about, how to be more efficient, how to be more effective. You're going to have issues of special education services not being met. And you're going to go to someone that is now in a different department that hasn't done this. And who's going to suffer? The parents and the students with disability, students furthest from opportunity. So it sounds nice to break things up, but when you don't have an answer, when things come up, we're going to be dealing with these impacts for I would argue over a decade. There is something to be said about making sure that the system is designed to meet the needs of the consumer, in this case, our students.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else? I noticed you brought notes. Is there anything else you want to
cover? More education-related stuff. I think I covered a lot of it in terms of how important it is to remember the growth of our country is dependent on how well we educate our youth and give students opportunities. And I think in this country, we have to remember that education is the foundation. You're not going to build skyscrapers on crumbling foundations, right? And whether we're cutting research dollars for higher ed or limiting the amount of talent from other countries that come here to then learn in our institutions and stay here and solve our problems, we're weakening our defense. You can be bravado and be defense and how strong our military is. That's great, but I think education is our best defense.
Can I just say on that, something that is so irritating to me is that of all the shit that other countries, these Europeans, anybody else give America, our higher education, it was unimpeachable. I would say, like, people from all over the world come to the United States to attend some of these universities, and to see those come under attack, it's like, man, like, these are like some of the few things that all of us could kind of be proud of. And actually, that was one of the things. I don't want to. We're already past.
No,
I
we're
don't want
good,
to dovetail too much, but like, one of the things that was so frustrating to me. I think you've written a lot about, like, there are problems. You just have the political will. You can do them. Is when I looked at COVID and I looked at everything happening with COVID, and especially with things like masks and everything else, there was this time period where we were like, well, we don't know if we can do this, or we don't have the manufacturing and we can't make the machines so we can do this. But once the political will is there, my God, the United States of America.
We could do anything.
And yeah, not only, but so we can do anything. We can do anything. But the fact that it's so hard to get that there, and then even when we do amazing things, it gets undermined so much by future players. Like, I look at, not to get to the most political topic, like the vaccine stuff or whatever, everybody around the world, China wishes they had developed our vaccines. Russia wishes that they had developed our vaccines. And even when we do these amazing things, what Biden was like 100 million in 100 days, got it done, I think, in 50 days.
Yeah.
Nobody was able to do that, and it's hard to even take credit for that. And it's like, man, if there were just something like, even I hate him more than anyone else on the planet right now, Elon Musk. But like, oh my God, like watching the rockets come back down to the planet, and Tesla pushing the electric vehicles forward, that industry 10 or 20 years.
Yeah.
There's so much stuff here that if we could just get on the same page, we would just dominate.
I could feel your
yeah.
But let me just say this: we are in a period of time, but this country is the greatest experiment. And this is a very bad blip, but we are still the United States of America. And we, our universities are the envy. I remember when I was doing that residency at Harvard, there was some concern if the international students were going to come back because of the visas. They were coming up with a plan B, because what if the students were not allowed back in? The talent that we would lose. And these students want to come and solve problems that we have here in the United States. We have, and it's such a beautiful thing that we have here, that we are cutting ourselves at our knees when we're hampering our universities from providing the best research. And, recently when Israel bombed the Iranian headquarters of their scientific institutions, why did they do that? They cut out the science. They said that's what we're gonna bomb, so that we could stop their science of whatever they're building to come at us. We are starving our institutions.
That for free. We
are doing our enemies' work for them. That's a blip. We got to do better. And I share your frustration, and I see it at the university level. And the students just want to learn. They just want to solve problems. This BS, this political BS, that's my generation. We got to do better. Our youth, we got to do better. And sometimes we just got to get the hell out of the way. And that's kind of where I feel like, going back to, you said, look, our K-12 public education system serves well over 80% of our students in this country. Our country's growth is dependent on how well we protect public education. Our higher education system is the envy of the world. It's at risk of being damaged from within. We got to protect our higher education institutions. We got to improve them. I'm not saying that they're perfect. I'm not saying our K-12 is perfect, but we got to improve it. We cannot do our enemies' work for us by eroding education in this country, or else we got bigger issues down the road. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
All right. Hey, I really appreciate it.
Good chatting, man.
Where can people find you? Is there any way you find
for
you
sure.
And then also, did you want to talk about, because you do consulting now?
Well,
and everything,
Cardona Solutions, cardonasolutions.com. It's kind of like what I'm thinking about my next chapter. And I really want to work, across the aisles, just to really, let's make sure that all students have options when they graduate, college and career options, right? So I'm working in blue states and red states around, look, let's move all that stuff. Where can we find common ground around giving students access to skills, to careers, to higher education? Another thing is, as much as it gave me great hair, FAFSA is easier to get now, right? And why are we not expecting the FAFSA completion rates to match our graduation rates? I think we're at like 70% of the students in the country filling it out. Imagine how much federal dollars are available for states if we got students to fill that out. I want to help that. And then leadership development. How do we support post-partisan America and leaders, making sure the leaders have the skills that they need? So cardonasolutions.com, but you can find me on all the socials at Teach Cardona, whether it's LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, at Teach Cardona. At the end of the day, I'm a teacher at heart, and titles change, passion doesn't. I really want to make sure all students in this country have the same potential, reach their potential, and have the same opportunities that I had growing up.
Awesome.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much, Miguel, for joining us here.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, I look
Thanks for your
forward-
time. It was a really good conversation. I loved it.
Cool. Thanks a lot. I appreciate
Thanks.
it. Intro screen? Cool.
That was good.
So the thing I keep thinking about is, was it worth it to be happy for a little bit? Even though it ended up sad? Or would it have been better if the whole thing never happened?